The chandeliers above Forrester Mansion glimmered like captured constellations, their soft gold light washing over white roses, champagne flutes, and the promise of a long-awaited reconciliation. Brooke Logan stood at the center of it all, radiant in satin, her hand clasped in Ridge Forrester's as cameras clicked and guests applauded. The scene was choreographed perfection, the culmination of years of heartbreak, separation, and rediscovery. It was supposed to be their happy ending, a symbol that after all the betrayals and misunderstandings, love could still conquer the jagged terrain of the past. Ridge's eyes shone with emotion, Brooke's smile trembled with relief, and the entire Forrester family exhaled together, believing the circle had at last closed. Yet happiness, in this house, has never been permanent. The moment the champagne corks burst, the mansion's great doors opened again, and in walked Taylor Hayes, elegant, poised, but carrying the kind of gravity that bends the air. Her hand was entwined with that of Deacon Sharp. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Cameras froze mid-click. Brooke's bouquet drooped slightly in her hand, as if the flowers themselves sensed the storm. Taylor's voice, steady but sharp, shattered the fragile calm. She and Deacon were engaged, and she was pregnant. The words rippled through the room like a seismic wave, cracking the illusion of peace. Gasps escaped the crowd, journalists craned forward, and Ridge's expression curdled into disbelief. It wasn't just shock, it was personal devastation. The man who had once loved Taylor enough to sacrifice everything for her now stared, as though seeing a stranger wrapped in revenge. Taylor's gaze didn't flinch. There was triumph in her eyes, but also an echo of pain. She hadn't come merely to provoke. She came to reclaim control over her narrative. For years she'd watched Ridge oscillate between her and Brooke, promising closure, but always leaving her heart half open, half bleeding. Now she would no longer play the waiting woman. Deacon, by her side, looked both proud and uneasy, like a man who'd stumbled into history by accident and couldn't decide whether to bow or flee. The murmurs swelled. Taylor Hayes pregnant? With Deacon Sharp's child? The scandal was too sensational to seem real. Ridge's first words to her were disbelief wrapped in accusation. He asked with the voice of a man betrayed by the very idea of change. Was she serious, or was this just another ploy to make him jealous? His face revealed the truth. He feared the latter because he needed to believe she still cared enough to manipulate him. And that, ironically, was the cruelest twist. He wanted to be angry, but beneath the anger lived a desperate need to know she still loved him. Taylor, sensing that weakness, refused to yield. She announced that her happiness was no longer tied to him, that she had found new meaning, new life, literally growing within her. The words left Ridge hollow. Steffi, protective and fierce, crossed the room in defense of her mother. Her voice, trembling but resolute, accused her father of selfishness, of wanting Taylor preserved like a safety net whenever his marriage to Brooke faltered. "You never really let her go," she declared. "You just keep her on standby while you chase what you call destiny with Mom." The accusation pierced Ridge deeper than any insult could. Around them, the family shifted uncomfortably. Eric Forrester frowned with paternal sorrow. Thomas watched with wounded loyalty, and Hope Logan, caught in the crossfire of her parents' and step-parents' entanglement, froze between instinct and allegiance. Hope's inner conflict was almost unbearable. Deacon was her father, flawed yet striving, and she had quietly rooted for his redemption. But Brooke, her mother, her protector, stood now humiliated before the press, her happiness collapsing in real time. Hope's heart tugged in opposite directions, toward defending her father's right to start over, and toward shielding her mother's fragile dignity. The cameras turned to her face, hungry for a reaction, but she gave none. Inside, she wanted to scream. Brooke herself was caught between disbelief and numbness. She had spent decades fighting for Ridge's love, believing that destiny justified every tear. Tonight was supposed to prove she had finally won. Yet as she watched Taylor holding Deacon's hand, something shifted deep within. For the first time, Brooke questioned not Taylor's motives, but Ridge's. Was it possible he had never truly closed that door? The way his eyes lingered on Taylor, the tremor in his voice, it all betrayed an attachment that time and vows could not erase. Brooke's pride stiffened her spine, but inside, humiliation spread like frost. The press whispered feverishly, recording every tear, every flinch. The reunion had transformed into a theater of chaos. Eric tried to restore decorum, urging everyone to take a moment, but emotions were beyond control. Steffi hurled more accusations about Ridge's ego, about his inability to handle women who chose their own paths. Ridge fired back, claiming Taylor's revelation was an ambush staged to ruin Brooke's day. "You couldn't let us be happy," he spat, and Taylor, with a slow, devastating calm, replied that she had long since stopped trying to ruin him. He ruined himself every time he confused possession for love. The statement hung heavy in the air. Deacon, caught between the two women who had defined his reputation for chaos, finally spoke. His voice trembled with sincerity. He cared for Taylor, he insisted, and their engagement was real. Yet even as he said it, his eyes flickered toward Brooke, a ghost of old affection haunting the confession. Hope saw it, too, and her heart sank. She realized that this triangle wasn't new. It was simply repeating itself with new victims and older scars. Outside, rain began to fall against the mansion's wide windows, thunder growling like an audience dissatisfied with the plot. Inside, alliances shifted subtly. Steffi moved to Taylor's side, clutching her hand like a soldier ready for battle. Thomas stood behind Ridge, though uncertainty clouded his face. Hope drifted between them, her loyalty fracturing. Brooke remained center stage, not as the triumphant bride, but as the embodiment of heartbreak, trying to maintain grace under humiliation. Ridge reached for her hand instinctively, but she didn't take it. Something in her had snapped. The silence between Brooke and Ridge became its own dialogue. She didn't need to ask if he still loved Taylor. She saw the answer in the confusion flickering behind his anger. For Ridge, Taylor's announcement had detonated something deeper than jealousy. It forced him to confront a truth he had denied. He wanted both women for different reasons. Brooke was passion and familiarity. Taylor was memory and redemption. He had tried to build a bridge between the two halves of his soul, but now that bridge was collapsing beneath the weight of his indecision. Meanwhile, Taylor's own victory began to feel hollow. The rush of power, watching Ridge's stunned face, seeing Brooke's composure falter, gave her satisfaction for only a moment. Beneath it lay guilt and an exhaustion she couldn't hide. Deacon squeezed her hand, sensing her tremor. Was she truly happy, or had she simply chosen defiance over vulnerability? The baby growing inside her complicated everything. Was it a symbol of new life, or a burden she hoped would anchor her to meaning? She wondered if she'd traded one emotional prison for another. Steffi, ever perceptive, recognized the crack in her mother's armor. She whispered words of reassurance, promising to protect her from the backlash. But even Steffi knew that the coming days would be brutal. The press would question the pregnancy, Ridge would demand proof, and Deacon's sincerity would be dissected until nothing pure remained. The Forrester legacy, always teetering between glamour and scandal, would once again feed the tabloids. And at the center of it all stood two women who had spent half their lives proving that love could justify any wound. Hope retreated to the hallway, fighting tears. Liam's absence tonight felt like a wound reopening. She longed for someone neutral, someone unentangled. She stared at her reflection in a gilt mirror and saw the embodiment of divided loyalty. She thought about her father, Deacon, the man who had tried, however imperfectly, to rebuild himself. Did he deserve this chance with Taylor? Maybe. But not like this. Not as a grenade thrown into her mother's wedding. For the first time, Hope questioned whether her father's search for redemption would always require someone else's destruction. Back in the grand hall, Eric called for calm. "We are family," he said softly, "and family must find a way through storms." But his words barely reached anyone. The emotional tempest drowned out reason. Brooke finally spoke, her voice trembling but clear. She congratulated Taylor, though her tone was ice. "I truly hope this makes you happy," she said, and though the words were gracious, the subtext was razor-sharp. Ridge flinched, realizing that Brooke's calmness was worse than anger. Indifference, once it arrives, is irreversible. Taylor, surprisingly, seemed to soften then. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. For all her pride, she never wanted Brooke's pain. She had merely wanted acknowledgement, proof that her love story with Ridge had mattered. "It did," Brooke said quietly, reading the thought in her eyes. "It just ended." That exchange, two women standing in the ruins of the same dream, felt almost sacred, like the final confession before absolution. Yet neither found peace. Ridge turned to Deacon. His voice dropped an octave. "You're using her." Deacon met his gaze without flinching. "Maybe you should ask yourself why that's so easy to believe." The words sliced through the room. Ridge took a step forward, fury darkening his expression, but Steffi intervened, warning him not to make a scene. Brooke, too, stepped between them, unwilling to let her re-wedding devolve into a fistfight. For once, Deacon appeared composed. He had walked into this fire knowingly, accepting the burns it would leave. As guests began to scatter, whispers filled the air like smoke. The press rushed to file breaking news. Flashbulbs ignited like lightning. Outside, reporters shouted questions about the pregnancy, the engagement, the collapse of the Forrester wedding. Inside, the family splintered into clusters of quiet crisis. Brooke retreated upstairs. Ridge followed, but hesitated at her door. Taylor stood alone near the fireplace, her hand over her stomach, Deacon nearby, but not touching her, sensing she needed space. Steffi lingered close, her eyes on her mother, her mind already calculating how to defend her in tomorrow's headlines. Upstairs, Brooke stared out at the rain. She felt empty rather than furious, as if her heart had run out of reactions. For years she had defined herself by Ridge's love. Tonight, she wondered who she was without it. She thought of all the times she'd fought Taylor, all the tears shed over a man who could never choose without breaking something in the process. Maybe Taylor's pregnancy was a blessing in disguise, a sign that destiny had finally made the decision for them. Yet part of her still ached, because she knew Ridge's heart would always live divided between past and present. Downstairs, Ridge sat alone in the living room once the others had gone. The decorations, roses, candles, golden ribbons, felt mocking now, reminders of a happiness stolen mid-sentence. His reflection in the window seemed older, wearier. He thought of Taylor's defiance, Brooke's composure, and realized he had underestimated both. For all his confidence as a designer, he had failed to design a life stable enough to hold the women who loved him. A faint melody from the piano drifted through the silence. Eric, playing softly, as if mourning the family's endless cycle. In the quiet corner of the mansion, Taylor confessed her fears to Deacon. She admitted she hadn't planned to announce the engagement so dramatically, but when she saw Ridge about to kiss Brooke under the chandelier, something inside her snapped. She couldn't let the chapter close without asserting that she, too, had found happiness. Deacon listened, his hand resting lightly on hers. He told her he didn't regret standing by her side, no matter the fallout. For all his past misdeeds, this moment gave him a strange sense of honor, protecting a woman who refused to be invisible. As dawn approached and the last guests departed, the mansion returned to uneasy stillness. The petals from Brooke's bouquet lay scattered across the marble floor, mingling with raindrops blown in through an open door. Hope helped clean quietly, her mind a storm of contradictions. She thought of her father's brave but reckless heart, of her mother's wounded pride, of Ridge's torment, of Taylor's impossible resolve. She wondered if love in their world was ever meant to be pure, or if it always required casualties. By sunrise, Ridge and Brooke faced each other again in the dim bedroom. He tried to speak, to justify, to promise, but she stopped him with a single look. "You don't need to explain," she said softly. "I saw everything I needed to see." Her tone carried no hatred, only fatigue. Ridge's shoulders slumped. For the first time in decades, he realized he might truly lose her. And perhaps, he thought, she deserved the freedom that always eluded them both. Meanwhile, Taylor stood by the ocean, the early light brushing her face with silver. Deacon joined her, placing a tentative arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, not out of passion, but gratitude. Inside her, the faint flutter of life reminded her that chaos could still create something new. Yet as she stared at the horizon, she whispered to herself a question she couldn't silence. Was this child conceived in love or in loneliness? The waves offered no answer, only the endless rhythm of beginnings disguised as endings. Forrester Mansion would recover, as it always did. There would be new alliances, new betrayals, new attempts at forgiveness. But the night of Brooke and Ridge's ruined reunion would remain etched in memory as the moment the truth surfaced. Love in this family was never simple, never pure, and never final. Each heart carried both longing and pride, guilt and grace. Brooke, Ridge, Taylor, Deacon, Hope, and Steffi, all bound together by blood, by history, by choices too tangled to undo, stood now at the edge of another chapter, knowing that the storm had merely paused, not passed. And somewhere in the echo of applause that had once celebrated their happiness, a new tension took root, a whisper that nothing in this house ever ends. It only changes shape, returning again and again like the tide that forever beats against the shore. The night that had begun as a glittering fairy tale had long since collapsed into silence. In the vast, echoing corridors of Forrester Mansion, the remnants of the ruined celebration still lingered, the scent of roses crushed under hurried footsteps, champagne flutes half empty, confetti trampled into the marble floor like the footprints of ghosts. Brooke had locked herself upstairs, her pride fractured but her composure intact. The guests had fled into the rain. Only Ridge Forrester remained awake, pacing before the grand piano like a man possessed, replaying the scene over and over in his mind. The moment Taylor Hayes had stood before the cameras, her hand clasped in Deacon Sharp's, her voice unwavering as she announced both an engagement and a pregnancy. Those words, calm and devastating, still rang through him like a bell he could not silence. In the first hours after the shock, Ridge's grief had masqueraded as confusion. But by dawn, it hardened into something darker, jealousy, sharp and unrelenting. He had told himself it was impossible, that Taylor had invented the pregnancy to wound him, to humiliate him publicly. The woman he had loved for half a lifetime could not, would not, carry another man's child, least of all Deacon's. The thought tore through him like acid, burning away logic, leaving behind only the animal need to know. He was Ridge Forrester, after all, a man who built empires with precision, who trusted evidence more than words. And if Taylor dared to lie, he would expose it. If she told the truth, he would find a way to make it untrue. Days passed, but Ridge's obsession grew instead of fading. He could not eat, could not sketch, could not sleep. Every design he touched dissolved into a blur of anger. His nights became loops of questions. When had it begun? How had he not seen the signs? And his mornings began with the same vow, to uncover the truth. Brooke, though still furious, recognized the look in his eyes. She had seen it before, years ago, when his love for Taylor had turned into a kind of addiction he couldn't control. But this time, jealousy didn't draw him toward Taylor. It pushed him into madness. He found his unlikely ally in Finn, the young doctor who happened to be both his employee and his son-in-law. Ridge approached him under the guise of concern. The conversation began with feigned casualness. How's Taylor's health? But soon dropped the mask. I need to know if she's really pregnant, Ridge said one night in Finn's office, his voice low, as though afraid the walls themselves might listen. Finn's eyes widened, immediately understanding the ethical danger. Ridge's request wasn't a question. It was a command wrapped in desperation. He wanted access to Taylor's medical records. He wanted confirmation, proof, anything that could make sense of the chaos she had unleashed. Finn hesitated, torn between duty and loyalty. As a doctor, he knew what Ridge was asking was illegal. As a family member, he understood the storm that would erupt if he refused. He told Ridge he needed time, hoping that reason might cool the man's temper. But Ridge pressed harder. "Your family," he said, "and she's lying to all of us." His words dripped with conviction, but underneath lay fear. Fear that Taylor's life had truly moved beyond his reach, that the world no longer revolved around the magnetic pull between them. Finn resisted, as long as he could. But Ridge's relentless pressure, his promises, his anger, his barely contained grief, finally broke something in the younger man. One night, Finn accessed the hospital database under the pretext of a standard review. What he found froze him. The records confirmed Taylor's pregnancy, estimated at nearly 3 months. More than that, preliminary genetic data linked the father to Deacon Sharp. Finn stared at the screen, his hands trembling. This was no manipulation, no fabricated headline. It was real. The truth Ridge claimed to want was about to destroy him. When Finn delivered the results, Ridge's face shifted through disbelief, fury, and something that looked like heartbreak. "That's impossible," he whispered. She couldn't. His mind rejected the facts as though they were physical blows. "Run it again," he demanded. "There has to be a mistake." But Finn shook his head. The data was conclusive. The child growing inside Taylor was Deacon's. The silence that followed was suffocating. For a long time, Ridge said nothing, just stood there, staring at the papers in Finn's hands. Finally, he whispered, "Then she's really gone." The realization hit him harder than any betrayal. For years, Taylor had orbited his life, sometimes near, sometimes distant, but always tethered. Even when she'd disappeared to Africa, even when she'd sworn to move on, Ridge had known, somehow, someway, he still held her heart. Now that illusion shattered. This child, this new life, was proof that Taylor's future no longer included him. It wasn't a weapon to wound him. It was a wall that shut him out forever. But if the truth crushed Ridge, it enraged Taylor. Because she soon discovered the violation. Finn, eaten alive by guilt, confessed everything. He told her about Ridge's demand, the illegal access, the secret test. Taylor listened in stunned silence, the color draining from her face. She had expected anger from Ridge, perhaps suspicion, but not betrayal, not this. The man who once told her she was his sanctuary had turned her into a suspect. Every word of tenderness they'd ever shared curdled into poison. When she confronted Ridge, it wasn't with tears, but with ice. She found him alone in his office, staring at a half-finished design he hadn't been able to complete. He looked up, startled by the sound of her heels on the floor. She laid the test results on his desk, the same papers he had forced Finn to retrieve, and said quietly, "You couldn't even trust me to tell the truth." Her voice didn't tremble, but the emotion behind it was volcanic. Ridge opened his mouth, but no words came. Taylor continued, "You said you loved me once. But love without trust is just control." Then, before he could respond, she added the final wound. "And the child you doubted more than you doubted yourself is real. He's Deacon's son. You can stop searching now." Ridge flinched, as if struck. For a moment, neither moved. The office, with its sketches and mannequins, became a battlefield littered with invisible debris. The memories of kisses, arguments, reconciliations, all now meaningless. Taylor's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her resolve held. She turned and walked out, leaving him staring at the door she'd closed, perhaps for the last time. News of Ridge's actions spread quickly, as things always do in their world. Deacon found out through Finn, who couldn't bear the guilt of silence any longer. The moment he heard Ridge's name, Deacon's temper ignited. He stormed into Forrester Creations like a man ready for war, his voice booming through the corridors. "You went behind her back," he shouted, shoving past the startled staff. Ridge, still raw from his confrontation with Taylor, stood rigid as Deacon confronted him. "You broke the law," Deacon said, "and you broke her trust. You think you can treat her like property? You think you can dig through her life because you can't handle losing." Ridge tried to fight back, but his arguments faltered. "I needed to know," he said, voice shaking. "You needed control," Deacon snapped. "You couldn't stand that she moved on without you. That's not love, Ridge. That's fear." The two men faced each other, every ounce of rivalry between them boiling to the surface. Two fathers, two former outlaws in their own ways, both tied to the same women, both defined by their pride. Deacon warned that if Ridge didn't back off, he'd press charges for invasion of privacy. But Ridge hardly heard him. His mind was trapped in a loop of disbelief, unable to accept the finality of what the DNA confirmed. The fallout rippled outward. Brooke, though horrified by Ridge's behavior, couldn't entirely suppress her empathy. She had seen what jealousy could do. She had lived it herself. She told him gently that he had to let Taylor go, but Ridge couldn't. His world had always revolved around her in some way, first as a lover, then as a rival, then as an ideal he could never quite capture. The idea of Taylor building a life with Deacon, of Deacon's child growing within her, filled him with a kind of existential dread. Without Taylor's gravitational pull, who was he? Taylor, meanwhile, found herself torn between rage and sorrow. Deacon tried to reassure her, promising to protect her and the baby, but part of her couldn't shake the sadness that Ridge's distrust had planted. She wondered if she had ever been truly seen by him, or if she'd merely filled the role he needed her to play, mother of his children, moral compass, the woman who waited. Now she wasn't waiting anymore. She was carrying a future that had nothing to do with him, and that realization was both liberating and terrifying. Finn found himself caught in the crossfire of loyalty and conscience. Steffi, learning of his involvement, was furious, not because he had betrayed her father, but because he had allowed himself to be manipulated. "You knew it was wrong," she told him. Finn agreed, his remorse heavy. He admitted he had hoped confirming the truth might somehow calm Ridge, not destroy him. Instead, it had detonated an entire family's equilibrium. For Ridge, the days that followed blurred into one another. He stopped showing up to meetings, ignored calls, and spent hours wandering the beach below the Forrester estate. The ocean's roar became the soundtrack to his unraveling. He thought of the child that wasn't his, the woman who no longer needed him, and the love he'd corrupted through mistrust. Every wave that crashed seemed to echo Taylor's final words, "You couldn't even trust me to tell the truth." When Deacon later arrived at the beach, he found Ridge sitting on the rocks, eyes hollow. The two men exchanged no words at first. The tension between them was so thick that even the sea breeze couldn't cut through it. Finally, Deacon spoke, quieter now. "You could have just asked her," he said. Ridge didn't look up.